Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar in association with Project Objects, Prospering in an Increasingly Complex World with Charlie Pellerin. I'll introduce Charlie in just a moment, but my name is Andy Jordan. I'm going to be the host of the event today, and just a couple of things for you before we get started. First off, the sound is delivered through your computer or through the dial-in number, so if you have any problems with that, can you just check the settings at your end? Everything looks to be working fine at our end, so I think we're good to go on that. This is a very intense session today, so there's probably not going to be time for a live Q&A at the end, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in and we'll make sure that we get those to Charlie as we go. There's also a PDU that's available for this session, and I'll give you information on that at the end. Now, before I hand over to Charlie, just let me give you a little bit of background on our sponsor today, Project Objects. Project Objects is a leading provider of innovative project portfolio management, or PPM software, and it's been recognized by Gartner in their Magic Quadrant for IT project and portfolio management, as well as the Magic Quadrant for cloud-based project and portfolio management services. Project Objects offers a comprehensive enterprise project management platform. It combines high-performance project management tools with powerful analytics, portfolio dashboard modules in a single solution. The Project Objects Suite, which is available both as software as a service and on-premise deployment, it's based on international best practices and standards for project and portfolio management, including PMBOK, Prince2, and the IPMA, and it facilitates a progressive approach to PMM, starting simple and growing to the very complex that is mirrored throughout the entire solution. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to visit projectobjects.com. So let me introduce Dr. Charlie Pellerin, who's going to lead this webinar for us. He's got a PhD in astrophysics, as well as an executive MBA from Harvard. As NASA's Director of Astrophysics, he led the team that built the Hubble Space Telescope. He launched it with a flawed mirror, and then he mounted the mission that repaired it while it was in space. He's the author of How NASA Built Teams, published by Wiley in 2009, as well as the president of 4D Systems. This is going to be a fantastic webinar, so Charlie, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. I hope you find this utterly fascinating. I certainly do, and I don't know other people that actually speak about this. This is about a lot of things, but the main thing I want you to think about is how complex the world has become, and I'll talk more about this, and the need to manage the field that controls human behavior, which I call the fifth force, which is team, social, context. There'll be a lot more about this. And I'll show you how to do this, how to measure and manage this field, and I'll show you the consequences of failing to do so, which are profound. So here's the elevator speech. This is the sort of 30-second version of what we're going to be talking about. There's an invisible field that drives human behavior, and unmanaged, the failure to manage this field caused Challenger to explode and Korean Airlines to crash at 17 times international norms, and I'll go into this in more detail. And it can cause you to lose your job, bankrupt your company, so forth and so on. So this is really going to blend in my NASA experience as a program director and the work I've been doing for the last 20 years after the Hubble failure, and how to do this. And there's a system that that's mostly free that I'm going to show you that you can use. You can buy my book if you like. It's a reference manual for the work, but business books, mine included, don't work. We're basically behaviorists here, and I have no knowledge of a business book that ever changed the behavior substantially. We have online tools, which is the only thing we charge for, and it's not very expensive. They're called assessments, but they're really developmental tools. They take 15 minutes online. Workshops that we provide, and you, by the way, if you want to do the workshop yourself, all the slides are free at my website, and you can learn to do it. There's also audio of me briefing the slides, and so you can do this yourself if you like. We have coaches, and again, any coach can learn to do this. And our coaches mostly use a tool called the context shifting worksheet. I'm not going to talk a lot about this today. Again, you can find out our website. But it basically came out of the sort of 10 years after I left NASA, where I worked as a consultant for industry. And what I found was that people never posed a problem that was solvable. I was thinking about Albert Einstein's quote that says you can never solve a problem with the level of thinking that created it. And I turned it to you can never solve a problem within the context that created it. So this changes the context. It's a problem-solving tool. It takes about an hour, and it works very, very effectively. You're probably all familiar with the fact that there are fundamental forces of nature. The gravity force we all experience every day, and we unconsciously correct for it. If I wasn't correcting for gravity now, I would fall down on the floor. The fifth force works the same way. It's a field we sense unconsciously and correct for it. You're surely familiar with electromagnetism. You see it manifested in magnets and in lightning, things like that. And two other forces that are only of interest to physicists, I believe, the so-called strong or nuclear force and the weak force. That's it. That's all Mother Nature has. Everything in nature is explained by those four forces. And scientists and engineers study these, usually taking years, and they develop individual technical abilities. Now, this is important because having a bunch of graduate degrees, what I realized is that I was totally socialized into being an individual achiever, when in fact almost everything today requires teamwork. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I think it would be fair to say that collaboration was a synonym for cheating. The fifth force is man-made. This is what we're going to talk about. It's of interest to teams and leaders, and it's easy to learn how to manage it. These processes are simple and straightforward, and it's about managing collective behaviors. It's about team building, and it's about leadership. And so those five forces, I believe, are the ones that are important for everything. I want to take you on to an interesting sideline of thinking, and that is the energy that's available. On average, humans have as much energy as we can extract from the sun, either in older times in photosynthesis or solar heating, today with photovoltaics. And that's all we have on average. So in a given day, all humans have is energy they can extract from the sun in a day. Now, occasionally societies get surges of excess energy, most notably the Roman Empire. They figured out how to take an army, feed it with, take energy away that other people had in the form of food, money, and mostly slaves. The biggest, I think, money maker for the Roman Empire was enslaving people. And so what happens is that every society, and you can Google on a guy named Joseph Tainter, T-A-I-N-T-E-R, that has a beautiful set of YouTube lectures about this. Every society inevitably increases complexity when there's excess energy. The Roman Empire increased social complexity, and then when they couldn't feed it, of course, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Think about today. We're harvesting energy stored over millions of years, and we're igniting an unprecedented explosion of social complexity. The impacts are largely unnoticed. I think it's fascinating that I was talking with Andrew before we started. Andrew's in Toronto, I'm in Boulder. Roberto lives in Chile. This is the nature of the world today. Socially complex arrangements. Teams are multicultural, multinational. Most of the corporate clients I work with have multinational teams building things. And we don't notice or think much about this. And if you don't manage it, and I've changed it to red here for a flawed social context, the effects will be profound. And this is why you must measure and manage your fifth force field in your company, in your team, and that's what this whole talk's about. What are some of the consequences of unmanaged fifth forces? Well, high-tech examples, I've already talked about Challenger and Korean Airlines, and I'll talk more about those. And also, of course, the Hubble mirror flaw, which I was very closely associated with. But low-tech, for example, a flawed social context caused destruction of a weather satellite. I'm going to give you an example of a diner that was going out of business until they realized the context was broken. And even Fukushima Daiichi, once again, this failure was not technical, it was social, and I'll show you how that works. By the way, I could go on like this all day. Almost everything, when you look closely at it, has a social root cause. So Challenger, I know a lot about Challenger. I had a payload in the cargo bay. My guys worked with the astronauts that had a lot of astronaut operations, and the people who managed the boosters were good friends of mine and very, very competent managers and engineers. So the question is, what was the root cause of the Challenger explosion? Was it technical abilities or managerial abilities, or was it the social context? Well, I'm watching this, and one of my great heroes, Richard Feynman, did a demonstration. By the way, there's a longer story about this. I'm not going to take time to tell a fascinating story about this. But he was stimulated by another member of the review board to follow up on an astronaut's claim that the rubber O-rings were not inelastic as the way NASA management claimed. He dropped the O-ring in a glass of water on television. picked it up and saw that the O-ring stiffened, and he said, I think we see the problem. And the great difficulty with that was, at that point, I quit watching, and that was a terrible mistake, because if I had continued to watch more carefully, I would have seen what came out in the final review board report, and that was a lead by a sociologist named Diane Vaughan, who wrote a 600-page book about this later. And she said the important question, and by the way, Feynman also talked about this in interviews that I didn't watch at the time, was why did the launch team proceed to launch when all the data suggested otherwise? The fifth force was enormous pressure to launch. At this time, the shuttle was the National Space Transportation System. Every payload and the U.S. was flying was on it. Every launch delayed downstream. Every worker had a screensaver, launch, launch, launch. And in that pressure to launch, they descended into what Diane Vaughan called normalization of deviance. You may know this as incremental stupidity. And they unconsciously required ever stronger technical arguments to delay a launch than to continue. Then she goes on to say, it is unfortunate that the sociological explanation is the correct one, as these forces are invisible and unacknowledged. Well, I was fascinated by this. And now I'll tell you that if they had used the tools I'm going to show you today, we could, and I believe would have prevented this disaster. It was social at its root cause, not technical. Because I didn't pay attention to this, I didn't look for this problem in Hubble. And so in 1990, in my 8th year of leading the Hubble team, went down to Kennedy, launched the telescope, and went into orbit fine. The early deployment was okay after some technical difficulties with the solar arrays. Telescope a month later is working. We did the test everybody had been waiting for, opened the aperture bay door, and took a look at the images. This is what a small ground-based telescope can do with a nearby galaxy called M100, 24-inch ground-based telescope. This is the best Hubble could do. The telescope was useless. I was suddenly in the middle of arguably the worst disaster in the history of science. So the question is, was the cause technical? What kind of technical people do you think attracted Hubble? Do you think the engineers and managers were incompetent or the best in the world? And I'll tell you right now, they were the superbly competent people, had done similar things before with classified satellites. So why did this happen? Well, I was a member of the Failure Review Board, which was an erroneous assumption. I was not on the program in 1977 when the mirror was fabricated, and so I was assumed to be not culpable. And it took months to figure out what happened, and finally we found that a device called a null corrector, which is a gadget used to what's called figuring the mirror, was misspaced by an enormous amount, 1.3 millimeters. And this was the cause of the problem, and I thought, great, it's a technical problem, and you know, you can't watch everybody, at least it's not a management problem. Well, the review board chairman was more diligent and looked more deeply, and he saw two things that bothered him. One was that there were numerous measurements of the mirror made with other devices that were rationalized away, and in this case, it was actually the technical geniuses of the Hubble team that let them do this to get rid of, to sort of rationalize away a problem they didn't want to imagine was real. And then he found out NASA that they'd never told NASA about this. And so when he went to the Congress to explain how we spent 15 years and what would be $5 billion today and built a completely useless telescope, he told them, well, it didn't sink into me what that meant, and nobody blamed me because nobody understood how this could be. It was a new idea. And so what the fifth force, as I now see it quite clearly, was Hubble overran 3 times during my tenure of $400 million each. The original budget for Hubble when we started was about $400 million, and I think you can imagine how much stress you take when you try and go to the Congress and get $400 million added into a program that was what it was supposed to cost when it started, 3 times over. And the way my mind worked then, and you might think it sounds kind of stupid, but it was the modeling I had from everybody in management down to up to the NASA administrator, that was clearly the contractor's fault. They were the ones that were overrunning the money. And it's a state that we talk about in workshops called the blamer state, where your assignment of blame is both certain and wrong. And so the contractor was at fault. And so what we did is we interacted with the contractor with relenting hostility. And by the way, the same root cause was at the bottom of Challenger, and the same NASA center involved. In this fifth force, they've rationalized suspicious results and then withheld them. So at that time, the term fifth force or team social context was not in the vocabulary, although I think they would have used it. So what happened was, I'm absolutely certain that fifth force management would have prevented the failure, and even more, I believe we would have saved hundreds of millions of dollars that we wasted by not managing the social context, and I'll come back more to the aftermath of Hubble in a few minutes. So Korean Airlines is a fantastic thing for me because it was crashing at 17 times international norms in the 90s, but what fascinated me was it went on for 4 years. What erroneous assumption were they making that caused them to let this go on for 4 years? Do you think it was about the individual's piloting abilities or social context? Well, you know, you can test a pilot's individual abilities. You can put him in a simulator and you can see if he can land a 747 on an icy runway with a 20-knot tailwind and 2 engines out. And the Korean airline pilots were able to pass the simulator tests. And so this was a complete mystery until a small subsidiary of Boeing put observers in the cockpits, and what they saw was that the fifth force that was causing the planes to crash was Confucianism, Korean style. They had imported this into the cockpits, and what this meant was the first officers were not allowed to criticize their seniors when they made mistakes. So they just tuned out. In fact, what they saw was when the captain starts making errors, the first officer would pick up a magazine and read it because he was too embarrassed to watch. So fascinating thing. I can tell you from having moving into like almost 1.5 million miles with United, I know a bit about airplanes, and safe flight of a jumbo jet requires 2 pilots working as a team, 1 driving and 1 managing the avionics, and they work as teams today. But Alaton understood all this, and so what they did, what they asked Korean Airlines to do was 2 things. The first one was only allow English to be spoken in the cockpit, because if they went back into Korean, they'd bring their Korean culture back in. And the second was they implemented a thing called crew resource management, which is about relationships, personal interrelationships. It's an airline's version of 4D. Change the social context in the cockpit, change the fifth force, and safe flight was immediately restored. I mentioned NOAA N Prime, the satellite that was broken. I was a consultant to the Failure Review Board, and what they found was that the fifth force was a culture of habituated sloppiness in the Lockheed Martin plant. They ignored the procedures generally, and the one that got them this time was the procedure said they had to confirm that no one had removed the bottom bolts over the weekend, that another program had used them. And so what I find is when I make talks, people say they like examples like this because it doesn't have the complexity of a Hubble or a space shuttle. Very fascinating book about this subject, Training Ain't Performance. They talk about a diner where Harry's the owner, and his competitive advantage is in making really high-quality toast. He looks around one day, sees some competitors coming up the street, looks at the quality of the toast, gets worried. He hires consultants to train his waiters, and he was very lucky that he hired the guys that wrote this book, and they were smart enough to refuse to train the waiters and look at the social context. And what they found was that the trainers had too many roles, that they were asked to bust the tables, fill the salt and pepper shakers, take the orders, make the toast, deliver the orders. The second, there were insufficient toaster stations, and so it was impossible to make consistent toast. So in training would have been a total waste of money. So I want to ask you, how often in your organization is training used when it's not the right answer? And so they changed the context and fixed the problem, and the Harry's Diner not only survived but flourished. I mentioned Fukushima Daiichi. I followed this very closely because the TEPCO company that was responsible claimed it was the earthquake that caused the problem. Then they claimed it was a tsunami that caused the problem. I just waited. Finally, the government put forward a very high-level review board, and they said it was the culture of Japan that caused the problem. It was not the natural events. And the behavior that was operative here was reflexive obedience, reluctance to question authority, groupism, and insularity. They knew about the risk to the reactor and chose to do nothing about them. And I've been in contact with Kurokawa, the chair of the Government Review Board. I'm going to try and go give him a hand if we can work out a time. And his summary is really very, very potent. the disaster was both man-made and avoidable. So I hope by now I've given you a pretty good sample of the risks that are present with mismanaged social context. So I want you to leave the world of esoteric systems, go into everyday life, and I want you to ask yourself this question. Would you modify your behaviors automatically and unconsciously in each of these contexts? Giving or receiving a marriage proposal, having dinner with the fiance's family, excuse me, or at your bachelorette party, or hijacked on your honeymoon? And would you be sanctioned if you fail to appropriately adjust your behaviors? I think in the U.S., for sure, if you said the wrong thing at the fiance's family dinner, you get a kick under the table. If you did the wrong thing on your honeymoon, I think you would expect to be killed. And so the message is that we are in social context fields all the time, and we adapt behaviors to manage and work within them. I'm going to go back to Diane Vaughn's statement. It's unfortunate that the sociological explanation is the correct one, as these forces are invisible and unacknowledged. So what would we do if we're going to measure and manage invisible forces? Well, as a physicist, the first thing I would think about is some method of analysis, some way to analyze the field with a coordinate system, and second, some kind of a tracer particle to measure the field. So what happened to me after the Hubble flaw? Well, I put together the mission that ultimately fixed Hubble, and I did it against the direct orders of the NASA administrator and the person who's in charge of our congressional appropriations. And once I figured out how to do it, and it was obvious it was probably going to work, everybody forgot about that, and I was promoted up to the top of NASA. Well, I hated it up there. It's all politics. What I like to do is work with projects and build hardware and software systems. That's what I enjoyed. Working with the White House and the Congress was just really distasteful. So I had to do something else with my life. And I thought it might be interesting to try and figure out how whatever leadership was caused failures. I then got an appointment in the University of Colorado Business School as a professor for 2 years and began to study leadership and social forces. Well, in the middle of this, a professor put a paper on my desk, and it said over 6,000 books and articles have been written about leadership by business professors. And I got the message, and I thought, yeah, I understand what you're saying to me. How can I possibly make a contribution in a field that's been so extensively studied? And I thought about it and I said, well, there's some truth to that, but there are two things different about me from the rest of you guys. The first is I am a physicist, and you can't spend 5 years in undergraduate school and 7 in graduate school without changing your mind in some interesting way. The second is I've actually had big jobs in the real world, which none of them had. It was a very academic-based business school, and I've had a lot of successes in big jobs in the real world. So I'm reflecting on this, and I'm asking myself, what is it in physics that could be helpful? And I remember this thing we used to say to each other as undergraduates: the right coordinate system turns an impossible problem into 2 really hard ones. There must be a coordinate system that can do the same thing for leadership. So I spent the whole summer with the things in business books, and you know what they are. Every business book is essentially similar. It has anecdotes about somebody. In those days, they were about Bill Gates and Andy Grove and people like that. But somewhere in the book, there's the 4, 5, 6, or 7 things you're supposed to do. And I read all the books. I felt like I was doing something useful reading them, but when I reflected on it, it was actually a head fake, because if you're honest about it, during times of crisis, which is when people ask for leaders to show up, I could never remember the 4 things leaders did and do them. Anyway, so at that time I still believed in this, so I put these all around the wall of my office, and I began playing with coordinate systems, and of course physicists have lots of them, and trying to find some exotic way that can connect all this into a principle, because physicists like principles. This effort failed completely until the day that I decided to abandon the effort, I picked up the newspaper and there was a Dilbert cartoon. And the Dilbert cartoon said every consultant makes his living with a 2x2 matrix. I said, aha, I made it too hard. It's a Cartesian system, not these complicated things I've been looking at. At the same time, I was reading Jung's work in psychological types, the English translation of this, and he gave me a great gift. What he said was that we all organize our personality about 2 processes with an innate preference, meaning an innate preference at birth. And the first is information we prefer to use, whether it's intuited or sensed. And I said, this is great. He's given me a fundamental process, input, if you will, and some names for the work. And by the way, intuition is an unconscious integration of past experience, and sensing is simply what you see with your senses, your eyes, your nose, your ears, and so forth. And then he said, we all have an innate preference for how we decide, whether we use emotions or logic. And I thought, this is fascinating. So I began playing with this as a tool of analysis. So when you look at what's in his personality system, what personality you have when you have emotional deciding and intuitive information, it's a person who naturally values other people. And so I colored this green, like when you value people, you're growing them. And I named it the cultivating dimension. I used dimension because the word quadrant seems so stale. And then I looked at what Jung's work, when you have people that prefer to use sensed information and emotional deciding, is people who are into relationship. And so often if I'm doing this in person, I'll walk up to somebody in the room and I'll shake their hand and thank them for coming. And I'll note that what we had was a sensed experience in the moment, which was expressed emotionally with smiles usually, that kind of thing. So that's about including other people, relating with them. And then I looked at the personality type that when you use intuitive information and logic, which is where I live, this is the place of vision and imagination, and we naturally generate ideas, which is kind of my deal. And then I looked at the final one. When you're in logic and you're in sensing, you're into organization and process. And I saw these as, now I'll show you momentarily, in meeting very core human needs. So the color blue came from blue sky. In China and other places where I work a lot, red's a good color. It's not in the West, so I picked orange. And the mnemonic to remember it is our orange sun organizes the universe. And I used yellow over here, frankly, because I ran out of primary colors. And I find that people relate much more easily with the colors, which flow through all of our processes, than the names. So I want to show you Maslow's needs hierarchy. I don't think it's completely correct, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And here it is. Whoops, that's not right. How'd that get in there? Well, actually, that probably is right as a joke. Let's get more serious here. If we look at the needs hierarchy, the first level is physiological needs: air, water, sleep, food, pretty much in that order. If someone's holding your head underwater, you're not worried about a whole lot of other things. The next need is to feel secure and safe. Now, we all know what happens when these two needs aren't met, these two base needs, and here's an example. When these are not met, what people do is they revolt, and here's the Arab Spring, and this happened throughout history. When people can't eat or can't get clean water and don't feel safe with the government, they overthrow it. So we'll dispose of that and move on. And I want to bring you into these other fundamental needs, because most of us don't have a problem today with physiological needs or with some sense of feeling safe at some level. The next need that has to be met is the need to feel valued. It's an emotional need. We all need it. If the need is not met, the same as the other needs, you will not function. And by the way, that lines up exactly with the cultivating dimension, where people naturally appreciate others. Next need is to feel included. It's also an emotional need. If you're not sure about these, think about the relationship you were in when you did not feel valued. I guarantee you left it. You left it either physically or emotionally or divorce, that kind of thing. We all need to feel that we're accepted and belong. You might think back to maybe in high school when you were the last one to be picked for a team, something like that. These are deep, deep human needs that have to be met. Next one is logical need, not as strong. The emotional needs trump all this work. It's about the need for hope. Don't we all need hope to get out of bed in the morning and go to work or do whatever we're going to do? And the last one is responsibility. By that I mean the ability to respond. And the way we lose this ability is by going into drama states like blamer and victim. And so when these needs are met by people in the workplace, they perform at very high levels. This is the core of motivating people. This is the core of getting maximum performance. This is the core of competitive advantage, meeting these needs. If they're not met, then it all collapses down and you lose everything and you go back to the states I talked about before, unemployment or bankruptcy. So how do you make invisible fields visible? if I were with you in person, I'd take one of you and I'd pretend to put a red iron bar on your, and I'd ask you, using just your hands, can you tell if that's magnetized? And probably most people would say, no, I can't. And I say, that's right. But I want you to think back to maybe the 3rd grade, how you did this experiment. You put a piece of paper on top of the magnet, you sprinkled iron filings, and you tap the paper, and voila, you saw that there's not only a field, there's a dipole field. So what you've done is you used a tracer particle to see an invisible field. How might you observe invisible social context? Well, I want to take you back to that slide about the honeymoon and the fiancé dinner and the bachelorette party and the hijacking, as to how your behaviors change in each of those fields. And so the answer is you'd observe people's behaviors, and that's what our tools measure. What would be the first criterion to pick the behaviors? Well, I think you would logically pick behaviors that address core human needs, and the 8 behaviors that we measure and manage are all and universal. That's why this work is going on today in 75 countries. This is true for everybody. It's universal. So I want to talk to you about what the 8 behaviors are, and I want to put them in reverse order. I want to talk about the context that you would like to create. Would you like to have a team working in the context of mutual respect and open communications? If that's what you want, you need to habitually appreciate people, because that's what sets this up. And by the way, this one behavior, had it been practiced and understood, I'm convinced would have prevented both Challenger's explosion and Hubble's mirror flaw. And how different would the space world be today if Challenger hadn't exploded? Would you like a context of willful collaboration? If so, you need to share the interest that you share with other people. You need to address the interests you share with other people. My favorite expression that I'd put on every manager's desk in the world, if I could, is people do things for their reasons, not ours. When you address shared interests, you make the reasons the same. You get your needs met and theirs. This I got from the Harvard negotiation project that's written on a book called Getting to Yes. We typically instead tend to take positions rather than address interests, and we don't have collaboration. Next one is inclusion. And when you appropriately include people, they work in authentic relationship, and they're very efficient. And I will try to explain some of the psychology here and help a little with some examples. How does exclusion, a sense of exclusion, create anger? Let me show you another primate. This is capuchin monkeys. They live in groups, think teams like us. They know each other. You can give them a rock, they give it back, get a reward, and they'll do this over and over and over. Or if you give one a coveted grape and the other only cucumber, you can expect an attack. Think about this. If you give one person a higher pay than another that think they deserve it, they'll get angry. And so let's watch the experiment.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay, I think that illustrated the effect better than I could otherwise have done. How important is it to have a context of trustworthiness? How important is it that your customers trust you, your teammates trust you? This is about integrity. And integrity is about matching words with behaviors. And the behavior here is rigorously keeping all your agreements. Would you like to have a context of high creativity? I spent 10 years trying to find something that would stimulate creativity with no success, including buying these silly packs of playing cards and other things like it. And then I got it one day, that it's about addressing the uncomfortable reality. And the insight came when I was sitting there wondering why we couldn't deal with the Iraq War effectively. And what I got was that there was no agreement about the reality between the two political parties. And so these are elephants in the room. We solicit these in our assessment tools, and then we process them in workshops or with coaches with the context shifting worksheet. This is a really interesting one. How about magical solutions? So I was about 20 years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine about something that I wanted and couldn't find, namely a suitable wife. And he said, the problem is you're not sufficiently committed. And I reflected on it for a while and realized it's true. I was only partially committed to marriage and partially committed to being a bachelor. And he said, the day you decide you're 100% committed, the person will show up, and that's exactly what happened to me. You can read about the story in my book. So psychologists call this the red convertible syndrome. Have you ever had this experience that you're thinking about buying a certain kind of car and suddenly they're on the road everywhere? Watch for this in your life. It's ever present. One of my favorite examples is I was in Shanghai a couple years ago, and the client knew that my wife and I like to visit UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Sites, and he kindly arranged a driver with a car. It took us out into the countryside and dropped us off at the first place, and he said that he would be back to pick us up at noon. So he went off, and we came back at noon. He picked us up and took us to the next site, dropped us off, said he'd be back at 5. Well, 5 o'clock came, and there's no sign of him, and I'm getting scared because in China, even in Beijing, they won't take you in a taxi. Most taxis will throw you out if you can't speak Mandarin. And I'm in the middle of the hour and a half outside Shanghai in the middle of nowhere, and I'm starting to wonder how I'm going to get us back to Shanghai. Am I going to try and find a way to a bus station and buy a bus ticket in the countryside of China? As my anxiety's going up, I'm looking for the driver in the car on the street ever more anxiously. Now, he drove us out in a black Toyota, and I'm looking at the street up and down, and I'm thinking to myself, what a strange country. Every car is black. And then when he showed up, every car went back to being multicolored again. So what this is about is that the bandwidth of information, particularly visual, is far higher than we can process. And if you decide the outcomes you're committed to, it'll alter your perception. Now, I mentioned starting the Hubble servicing mission against the will of the very powerful people above me. People say, well, that was a great act of courage. And I say, no, it wasn't. There was no courage involved. It was in all the trauma that surrounded Hubble, and I could talk for a while about what it was like for my team to be in this mode. For all the trauma, I got it that there was nothing to be done except to go fix the telescope, and like it or not, I was the only person probably in the world with both the motivation and the resources to do it. And so it was an act that I could not refuse to do. That's how commitment works. I mentioned before the ability to respond. The way we lose our ability to respond is going into drama states. There are 4. The ones you're probably most familiar with are the victim. The victim says it's hopeless, there's nothing I can do, and does nothing. The blamer says it's your fault, and as Freud points out, the blamer state comes from self-anger. Finally, clear and achievable expectations. This is Gene Kranz, flight director for the moon landings and Apollo 13, you probably heard of, a good friend of ours, supporter. And I got it working through this work. It's all about accountability. Organizations waste far too much time shuffling around authority with organization charts. If you can decide the results you're accountable to produce, this will cut through everything. This is the basic structure of the 4D system, these 8 behaviors. Let's go back to the bigger picture about complexity going up very rapidly. What's interesting is that intellectual ability is adequate for technical matters, but social context management requires much more. And so this is, again, a reiteration of the same assets that are available. Almost everything's free on our website for you. My book, it's intellectual, does not create behavioral change, but it's a reference manual. When I was, years ago, I read Covey's book, 7 Habits, and I was very impressed by it. And I went to his school at Sundance for 2 weeks and found that it was very disappointing. After the first morning, nothing connected with the book. I did his 360, and those days you sent these sheets around to people, they mailed them in. This report comes back, and it says you can be difficult to work with. So I went to my boss at the time and said, it says here I can be difficult to work with from Covey's people. What should I do? He said, I don't know, you're my best manager, but it's true, you're difficult to work with. And so I went back to Covey and they said, we don't know what to do. So all these processes align and they all address the same 8 behaviors in the same ways. You can mix and match them. The online work has a very important additional ingredient, and that is repetition. Repetition is the core of human learning and feedback, and everything has action learning in it, and this also has progress tracking. The workshops have significant emotional experiences, lots of experiential work, action learning, and a systems perspective. The coaching is also emotional, and then the context shifting worksheet deals with emotions and provides solutions and has action learning throughout. This is the processes that we use. Now I want to talk about system engineering because this nebulous thing for the Force, I believe, has to be addressed in totality. And I used to explain how we system engineered Hubble, but people were scared by it. So I went to something simpler. How would you system engineer your home context? Well, the first thing you do is you build protection against the elements, against the rain, wind, and thieves. You teach your family to accept personality differences. You build a healthy family culture. You teach your family members how to appropriately express emotions and thoughts. You would then teach them behaviors that create this context I've already talked about: mutual respect, sense of belonging, reality-based hope. Then you get rid of family secrets because they make people crazy. So what do? We work with teams. We do the same thing. We build up a shelter with them and isolation from forces outside, the budget cuts, layoffs in the company, reorganizations, hostile management. This is exactly what the workshop flow is. People find the personality they were born with, the innate personality. We diagram their culture using the same system. We teach them how to live in attitudes that are affected by the emotions and thoughts they express. We teach them, in this case, 8 behaviors, not just 4, to manage the context. We surface the elephants in the room. And we process them with the context. The example of magnetism, one of the things that I like to do is use physical science metaphors for things that are otherwise complicated. If you wanted to align ferromagnetic particles, would you use tweezers? This is like my training at NASA. I was sent off with usually unassociated people for a week or 2, get some great ideas, find out utterly useless, come back and nobody wanted it back in the context I'd come from. Or would you want to use a field? Would you like to take a coil of wire and a battery and put a current through it and align everybody at the same time? This is exactly what happens when you use our processes, the 4D system, or any process that does this, to manage the context, because the context changes everybody's behavior simultaneously. So there, can you afford to develop people one at a time? No. Why should you? So this is used in million-person shoe factories in China because they can't develop 1 million people one at a time. So I want to show you some incredible data. What we call the team development assessments. They're developmental learning tools, but they also measure, so I put that term in there. And I had this astounding finding that these enhance performance 4% with every repetition. So what we do is we take a bunch of measurements of teams. We have like 2,000 or 3,000 in the database today. We histogram them. We fit a curve to them. And we divide the thing into 5 equal area quintiles. And the reason we do this is that I think a quintile is a good estimate of the precision of the measurement. Whether we benchmark teams and individuals, whether they're in the bottom quintile, then we can track progress as well. So this is the chart that changed my life in 2008. At that time we had 200 teams. Our database is today about 70% NASA and 30% commercial. We had almost 200 teams with multiple assessments, and we divide them in by the quintile they started in. So these are the roughly 40 teams that started in the bottom quintile, and their average score was 53%, which I believe and argue means they're returning 53 cents on a dollar. Then looked at what happened with the reassessment, which takes 15 minutes online on median time and about 90 minutes to process, and their performance went up 13%. This was astounding. What happened when they did the next one? Performance increased again, and so they got an average performance boost of 7% every time they did something that took 15 minutes online and about an hour to process. So I was ready to go run with this. Then I thought, wait a minute. We started here at the end, and so just random walk would move these people up. Now, it was not likely they'd move up in this sequence, but people would move up. So we took this set of 40 teams, looked at them, and we saw this. And took the teams that started here, and we saw this. Teams that started here, teams that started here. Well, this was a mind-blowing result for me. I was so astounded at this. I decided this does not belong to me, this belongs to the world. I stopped everything and started writing a manuscript for how NASA builds teams, and I took all our intellectual property, everything, workshops, all the processes, the context shifting worksheet, everything we'd guarded under lock and key, and I put all on our website and made it free to anybody, and it's there to this day for you. So let's take a look at some intuitive thinking about what is the difference between a team that's benchmarking here and a team that's benchmarking here. A team in the bottom would have a context of incessant criticism, the same thing that caused Challenger's explosion and Hubble's mirror flaw. Unrelenting conflict. Isolation and anger, think back to the monkey. No trust, broken agreements randomly. Blind optimism replaces reality. There's no commitment to anything that matters. It's full of drama, victims and blamers, and no one accepts accountability. I think a team in this extreme state you could imagine could almost do nothing. And let's contrast it with a team benchmarking in the top quintile. There's an atmosphere of mutual respect, powered by appreciation and open communications. There's willing collaboration, people work together. Effective inclusion gets rid of that anger. People like working together. High trustworthiness, everyone keeps their agreements. Think about a workplace where everybody did what they said, when they said, and the way they said. They have reality-based optimism, not head in the sand optimism. People are 100% committed to what matters to the team and the company. They're acting responsibly, doing actions that are required, not drama stuff. And they're tightly organized, and everybody understands what they're accountable for. We have a little mini workshop on this, and I tell people to take and post what you're accountable for on your office door. So when I wrote the book, I didn't take time to understand how the assessments did what they did. I was so much in a hurry to get this out. And now I get it. They're learning tools. And I used to think the online segment was the most important. As you go through it, it gives you the context of why the behavior is important, so you're learning. There are case studies applying the behavior in industry and in our company and in life. You can expand or watch if you want. And then I'm going to take you back to this idea of normalization of deviance. So the question is, if you have a team that's in a different state where they don't see reality clearly, and normalization of deviance like the Challenger launch team is what's impacting them, how do you mitigate that effect? And I didn't know how to do this. I was doing a workshop about 15 years ago, and I mused with the people in the room about how to do this, how to solve this. And someone said, I don't know how you solve it. And I said, well, I don't know. He said, you measure against standards. And I thought, that's right. So that's what we do. We measure the behaviors against standards. But by showing the standard for the measurement, you teach people what good looks like. And then again, repetition is really the driver of all adult learning. And these are so short. Anything you can do in 15 minutes, we recommend teams do them every 4 months or so. You get it over and over and over. In the early days, we used to brief the team reports ourselves. Now we brief the team leader, because as I looked at teams where this was highly effective and less effective, what I discovered was the factor I couldn't control was the ownership by the team leader. So now we brief the team leader, they brief the team, and they take 3 decisions. The first thing is to schedule their next assessment, and this sustains the learning. Decide if they want workshop modules or a whole workshop. And then finally, they do behavior-specific action items. This is really important, because what we've done is we've outsourced the team building to the team. They pick things that work in their context, and they integrate the behavior-enhancing actions with their technical actions that they're all used to. This is what typically happens. This is a team started in the bottom. Every 4 to 6 months, doing this over and over, they move up, up, up. They've moved from a working efficiency of 50% to over 80%. We've got dozens and dozens of teams that do this quite reliably. And today these processes, for example, are being used in the nuclear reactors and the world's largest nuclear fuel utility, Electricité de France. The Malaysian mines are using them. Lloyd's of London, and I mentioned before, shoe factories in China. So why does this work all around the world? Because it's based in needs that are universal and even into primates, as I showed you. Talk about forgetting. This is early research that we forget 90% of what we learn within a week. And here's a typical forgetting curve. They actually showed here, and this is actually in days. I don't know if this is right or not. But what happens is when you have a review or a reiteration, you restore it and the curve gets shallower and shallower. And that's why it works. Behavioral change needs repetition, and the assessment tools are the easy way to do it. So when we do workshops, we tell people we won't do a workshop unless you'll agree to do the reinforcement, because we're interested in giving you the gift of higher performance and not just entertaining you. And think about how you learned things in your life. If I say 6 times 7, I think you cannot resist 42. How'd you learn the times table? You did it repetitively. Every sports team has to practice. This is about behaviors, just like teamwork's about behaviors. You want to change behaviors, you've got to reiterate. And then 4D repetition changes habits and changed mine forever, and I'll talk more about that if we have time with a question. So what we tell people is you need to repeat on 3 time scales. Some internal action. One of the things that really works well is to have teams agree that at the start of every staff meeting they'll have a period for people to express authentic appreciation. A lot of our teams take the coaching. That works as well. By the way, you can do all this yourself. You don't need us for anything. The TDAs boost on average, and the redevelopment IDAs. Well, I have a little time here, so I'm going to tell you about my experience with individual development assessments. When I started doing this work, what I believed was I could not stand in front of groups and do these workshops unless I could actually live the behaviors. So I did the individual development assessment, which is just like the team, measured my 8 behaviors, at that time I had about 25 people working in the company, and the top sort of dozen leaders did my assessment, and I benchmarked in the middle of the top quintile. The powerful thing I did was schedule the next one, because then I know it's coming. So people who knew me back at NASA will tell you that I had a black belt in chewing ass. If you came into my office with a problem without a solution, you left with a bloody rear end. And so I still had that habit lurking around, and so when one of my guys would make a mistake, my first impulse was to pick up the phone and say something like, "How could you be so stupid?" Well, then after I realized the IDA is coming, I can't do that, I stopped myself. Instead, I called him up and said, "You know, I'd like to talk with you about a more effective way to do this process, or a more effective way to get this done." And then my next IDA, I moved up to near the top of the top quintile. Next IDA up to the top, and then after 2 years, I discovered something. I no longer had any impulse to go back to my old habit. I had changed my habit completely. And so this is how it works. If you do this repetitively, you get a new habit. And sometimes people say to me, "Well, Charlie, you know, doing this took you 2 years, or maybe 18 months. I noticed it after 2 years. Isn't that a long time?" And I said, "Actually, I don't think so. I think changing behaviors in 18 months or so that I developed over 60 years is actually pretty fast." And then finally, we tell clients you need to re-workshop, and mostly they do, and there's a reason why every workshop's different. I won't explain, but they do re-workshops after 2 or 3 years typically. So what do you do now? Well, go to our website. You get the dashboard. The dashboard's free. There's a small charge for delivering reports. You can see there. Again, run the report, choose your actions, redo it. You get the behavior enhancement, decide if you want to do workshops. And by the way, if you want to do workshop modules, I think it's the report has all kinds of statistical analysis in it. One of them is it benchmarks your behaviors and shows you there's limiting behaviors. And if you want to present the workshop module to your own team, it's easy to do. A workshop, I'd get a stand-up professional trainer that could learn this material using our website and stuff. but you could do the module yourself, or your HR person could learn it. Everything on the website's there to do it. So I'd like to close with this quote from Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And never doubt that a small group of thoughtful people with enough time to listen to a podcast in the middle of the day might change the world. Indeed, you might be the only people that ever will. So that concludes the presentation, and thank you very much, and I hope that it was useful to you. And if you want any of these resources, you can get all this stuff, including this slide set, which I'm going to update on the web in a couple of days. I've already talked about most of this. And if you have comments or questions, you need help with something, just email me directly. I'm glad to hear from you. So thank you very much, and there we are.
Charlie, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation, and I know that everyone will have got a huge amount out of it. Just a reminder for everyone, you'll see the 4dsystems.com website on the screen there now. If you'd like some more information on Project Objects that sponsored this, please visit projectobjects.com, and you can also schedule a demo there and learn a little bit more about their PPM suite. I did promise everybody that we would provide you information on PDUs. So this webinar is qualifying for a Category C PDU through the PMI. You don't need any special information for that. If you go to the professional development part of the PMI.org website and choose Category C PDUs, you can put in the dates and the information about this, and you'll be able to claim your PDU that way. We are recording this session. There will be a follow-up email sent with information from that and to get access to the material. So thank you, everyone, for attending today, and have a great day. And thanks, Charlie, for your time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.